Welcome back to CIA Declassified. Imagine you're a CIA analyst in 1961. You've never met with Nikita Khrushchev. You've never even been in the same room as him, but you think you know why he bangs his shoe on a table at the UN. You think you know how he'll react to a blockade in Cuba because you've studied the relationship he had with his father in a small coal mining town 50 years ago. This was Project Mercury. It wasn't about traditional spying, it was about medical and psychological analysis at a distance. The agency didn't just want to know what these men were doing, they wanted to know who they were when the cameras were off. They wanted to find the psychological DNA of power. The declassified reports from the CIA's Center for the Analysis of Personality and Political Behavior reveal a clinical, almost obsessive approach to leadership. Project Mercury utilized a team of world-class psychiatrists and anthropologists to build personality profiles of world leaders. They used content analysis, where every word a leader spoke or wrote was coded for psychological traits, looking for signs of narcissism, paranoia, or deep-seated insecurity. A quote from Dr. Gerald Post, founder of the CIA's Psychological Profiling Unit. We were looking for the organizing principle of the personality. If you understand the core conflict of a leader, be it a need for approval or a fear of humiliation, you can predict their behavior in a crisis with startling accuracy. We were essentially putting the world's most dangerous men on a virtual couch, end quote. The agency's profile on Fidel Castro was famously extensive. Analysts concluded that Castro had a messianic complex and was highly sensitive to perceived slights to his machismo. The psychological data was used to design operations like the exploding cigar or the operation meant to make his beard fall out. Theories based on the idea that public humiliation would cause him to have a mental breakdown. In the late 1960s, the agency focused heavily on Mohammad Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran. Analysts identified a grandiosity loop, a psychological state where the leader becomes increasingly isolated by his own ego, listening only to sycophants. The CIA warned that this made him vulnerable to sudden radical shifts in public sentiment, a prediction that proved hauntingly accurate during the 1979 revolution. A quote from a declassified 1967 internal memo. The objective is not to diagnose mental illness in the traditional sense, but to identify the political personality. We must determine if the subject is a compulsive who needs order or a narcissist who needs constant adulation. One can be reasoned with through logic, the other can be moved through flattery or the threat of irrelevance, end quote. One of the most bizarre aspects of the project involved the study of projective identification in Soviet leadership. Analysts believed that Soviet premiers often projected their own internal fears onto the West. By analyzing the specific accusations the Kremlin leveled against Washington, the CIA believed they could map the internal fractures and paranoias currently haunting the Politburo. While the basic profiling techniques are public, the section of the Mercury files concerning induced psychological destabilization is almost entirely blacked out. The heaviest redactions follow the profiles of friendly dictators. There is heavy speculation that the CIA didn't just profile enemies, but used these psychological blueprints to manipulate U.S.-aligned leaders. The theory suggests the redactions hide the methods used to trigger specific anxieties in allied heads of state to keep them dependent on American support. Further speculation surrounds the remote medical diagnosis logs. Analysts believe the redacted pages discuss the use of high-resolution satellite photography and biological waste procurement to diagnose the hidden illness of Soviet leaders. The speculation is that the agency could predict a change in the Kremlin's hierarchy months in advance by spotting the subtle physical tremors or skin discolorations of a dying premier. There is a persistent theory regarding the echo chamber protocol, a section of the files that is almost 90% redacted. Speculation suggests this involved the CIA secretly purchasing or influencing the very news source and private intelligence briefings a foreign leader relied on. By feeding the leader information tailored to their specific psychological triggers, the agency could essentially steer a dictator's decision-making process without them ever realizing they were being manipulated. The Mercury files include a significant section on succession crisis modeling. This involved creating composite personalities for mid-level officials in the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union who were likely to rise to power. The CIA would track these individuals for decades, building a psychological dossier that would be ready the moment they took the world stage. Another quote from Dr. Gerald Post on the profiling of Min Akim Begin. Min Akim Begin. When Begin and Sadat met at Camp David, we had a psychological profile of each. We knew Begin was a man of the book, obsessed with Jewish history and legalism. We knew Sadat was a man of the grand gesture. We advised President Carter on how to play these two personalities against each other to find a middle ground. It was psychiatry as statecraft. End quote. Was Project Mercury a success? Operationally, it was a mixed bag. The profiles were brilliant in hindsight, but often ignored by policymakers in the heat of the moment. However, it successfully changed the way the U.S. government prepared for summits. A quote from a declassified assessment of the 1961 Vienna summit. The profile on Khrushchev accurately predicted his attempt to bully the young President Kennedy. Kennedy's failure to anticipate the psychological intensity of the encounter resulted in a diplomatic setback that the Mercury data had explicitly warned against. End quote. By the 1970s, the success of the program led to the creation of the Political Psychology Division. This unit wasn't just analyzing leaders, they began analyzing entire cultures. They looked for national traumas, shared psychological wounds like the Great Chinese Famine or the Siege of Leningrad, and how leaders used those traumas to manipulate their populations. The project faced a major internal crisis during the Vietnam War. Profiles of Ho Chi Minh suggested he was a nationalist first leader who could not be deterred by traditional military escalation. Because this psychological reality conflicted with the political goals of the White House, the Mercury reports were often suppressed or dismissed as soft science by military brass. Mercury pioneered the science of biographic intelligence. As far as operational breakthroughs go, the coded speech protocol, the project developed an early form of linguistic software that could track the frequency of I versus we in a leader's speeches, using it as a metric for their current level of personal grandiosity or stress. Visual biometrics, the agency perfected the art of body language forensics, analyzing frame-by-frame film of world leaders to detect the micro-expressions of fear or deception. The Childhood Archive, the CIA established a massive worldwide network to gather school records, dental files, and family anecdotes of rising political figures, often decades before they actually took power. Mercury analysts pioneered the use of psychohistory. They would interview people who had known a world leader in their youth, teachers, distant relatives, or childhood rivals, to find the pivot point where their personality shifted. For Gaddafi, analysts traced his radicalism back to a specific sense of displacement he felt as a Bedouin in a rapidly modernizing Libya. The CIA realized that the map of the world isn't just made of borders and oceans. It's made of the scars and ambitions inside a leader's head. Project Mercury turned the human mind into a battlefield because if you can understand the king, you can control the kingdom. Next time on CIA Declassified, we move from the minds of dictators to the streets of America. We examined Project Scranton. Why was the CIA monitoring the leaders of the civil rights movement? We'll look at the declassified logs of the agency's surveillance of African American leaders during the 1960s, from infiltration protocols to the hunt for foreign influence in domestic dissent. We explore the day the CIA turned its eyes inwards. Join us for the home front. In the meantime, I'll see you in the archives.